Story 1. Back in the 19th century, small opposition newspapers in the Netherlands were called Lilliputters, which means midgets, because of their small size, which was a way to avoid having to pay for the newspaper stamp. The best example of this are the papers published by the fanatical Republican Eilert Meter, who received imprisonment for lèse-majesté, before being invited to meet King William II in person, who offered him an allowance if he ceased publishing. Meter later went back to publishing anyway, but admitted in his writings that he found the king a kind and friendly person. He was just opposed to having a king. Okay, you simply do not learn this in school because it is obscure and relatively unimportant. But still. Story 2. The circumstances surrounding the death of Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark are shrouded in conspiracy. In the months leading up to his death, many people reported that Lewis had become paranoid, claiming that he was being followed and that his life was in danger. In a desperate attempt for help, he sent a letter to his close friend, and then President Thomas Jefferson, to request an audience. While traveling along the Natchez Trace, he stayed a night at an inn. During the night, the owner reported hearing multiple gunshots but never went out to check on the source. In the morning, Lewis was found dead in his cabin, sitting against the wall looking at the door, rifle in hand and shot in the back. In addition, while the room was ransacked, the only missing objects of note were Lewis's writing bag and personal documents. After an official investigation, his death was ruled a suicide, and all further inquiry into the instance has been barred by the United States government. While Lewis himself did not have any immediate descendants, his extended family has submitted requests every year to have his body exhumed in order to confirm the cause of death. To this day, their requests have unanimously been denied. Story 3. Fun, true fact. In 1518, the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, experienced a bizarre dancing plague where dozens of people danced uncontrollably for days, some reportedly dancing to death. Historians believe it might have been caused by mass hysteria, ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus on rye, or even a psychological response to stress. Story 4. The Central Intelligence Agency deposed or destabilized many democratically elected leaders to install leaders who were more friendly to United States business policies, causing enormous loss of life and suffering all over the world. Story 5. A lot of people are taught that England's flag, a white background with a red cross, comes from St. George's banner, but it's often left out that George actually got his banner during his veneration as a warrior saint by the Templars in the Crusades. Many of the Templar banners were based on the flags of the Knights of the Round Table from Arthurian legend. So George actually got his banner from Sir Galahad, the knight who found the Holy Grail, according to the legend. There's a post I found with all the knights' banners included. It's fun to look at, as you can see the origins of a few famous flags in the banners. Story 6. The Harrying of the North. William the Bastard burning whole villages to the ground in the north of England to cement his rule over the country. In school, it's usually 1066, Hastings and bam. William the Conqueror. Here's the Tudors. Story 7. Rosa Parks wasn't the first. Ida B. Wells, a pioneering African-American journalist and civil rights activist. In 1884, Wells was traveling by train when she was ordered to give up her seat in the first-class ladies' car and move to the smoking car, which was already crowded. When she refused, the conductor and two men forcibly removed her from the car. Wells took legal action against the railroad company and initially won her case in the local circuit court, receiving a $500 award. However, the railroad company appealed, and in 1887, the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed the lower court's ruling, concluding that her persistence was not in good faith to obtain a comfortable seat for the short ride. Wells was ordered to pay court costs. This incident was a catalyst for Wells' lifelong commitment to civil rights and social justice. She became a prominent journalist, co-owning and writing for the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper, where she reported on racial segregation and inequality. Throughout her career, Wells documented and fought against the lynching of African Americans, becoming one of the most influential leaders in the early civil rights movement. Ida B. Wells' courageous stand against racial discrimination on public transportation predated Rosa Parks' more widely known protest by several decades. highlighting the long history of resistance to segregation in the United States. Story 8. Most stuff about the United States in this thread I learned about in high school from 2005 to 2009. It makes me wonder if a lot of people didn't pay attention, or maybe there was more taught in the advanced placement and honors classes. Story 9. How historical crucible Damascus steel was made. Not for any malicious reason, just because the people teaching history are often misinformed and believe it's a lost art. Story 10. That modern money came into existence by people storing their gold in banks and getting notes as proof that their gold was there. Banks found out they could write more notes of gold than there was actual gold being stored there. Story 11. When the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb, Castle Bravo, on Inuiatak Atoll in the Marshall Islands in 1954, it was many times more powerful than calculated. The residents of Inuiatak and Bikini Atolls had previously been forcibly relocated to Rongelap Atoll. Rongelap was downwind from the Castle Bravo radiation cloud. The United States did not evacuate them for 2 days and allowed them to return only a week later, even though the radiation levels were highly unsafe as we understand now. From 1954 to 1984, the United States repeatedly refused to evacuate the Rongelap residents, even as the birth defects and cancer rates continued. It was finally Greenpeace in 1984 who assisted in moving many of them to Majado Island in Kwajalein Atoll. If you go to Majado today, the signs on the church and school still say Rongelap. There is evidence that this refusal to evacuate was a calculated decision to study the long-term effects of radiation exposure in humans. Story 12. When we learned about Prohibition, it was presented as kind of this silly historical mistake. It was years later when I learned that in the 19th century, people were drunk basically all the time, in part because very few people had access to clean drinking water and would drink alcohol instead, which was often cleaner and safer to drink. So a big part of the anti-alcohol movement was providing safe drinking water. And we owe a lot of our drinking water infrastructure, like available public drinking fountains, to teetotalers. Story 13. In 1914, the Serbian government and military did conspire and organize the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand with nationalist terrorists, and that was already known back then. World War I wasn't just Austria-Hungary and Germany looking for excuses to go to war and blaming Serbia for something one Serbian guy did. By the way, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia that basically said, forbid nationalist propaganda against us, punish the military officials that we know are involved in the affair, and let us investigate on your soil, with the last part being what they refused. Story 14. The individuals defending the Alamo were the antagonists. At that time, Texas was part of Mexico. To attract settlers, Mexico allowed American farmers to relocate there and bring their enslaved workers. Slavery was not favored by Mexico, and it was soon banned throughout the entire country, except in Texas. A few years later, Mexico attempted to ban slavery in Texas as well. That's when the Texas Revolution began. The Texans were fighting to preserve slavery, not for liberation from an oppressive government. Not everyone at the Alamo perished. The enslaved workers were spared and largely contributed to our understanding of what occurred. If you visit the Alamo today, most of the details are omitted from the pamphlet and signage. It does mention the enslaved workers by name, but that's about it. The narrative of fighting to preserve slavery is not the one they wish to present today. I remember learning about the Alamo in school, and slavery wasn't mentioned, highlighting its absence from the actual site. Story 15. The Bhopal Disaster. A factory in India owned and operated by Union Carbide Corporation was making a pesticide. Through a combination of neglected maintenance, poor safety standards, and an undertrained workforce, a leak occurred. Over 500,000 people were poisoned, with upward estimates on deaths related to the incident being approximately 16,000. And it is the world's worst modern industrial disaster by a wide margin. For what it's worth, I don't think they don't teach you this in school because authorities are trying to hide it from you. I simply don't know a context where it would come up outside of a safety or regulatory class at the college level. Story 16. All throughout school, they told us the buffalo died from natural causes. I only just learned a couple of months ago that they died out because the American settlers killed them for sport to cut off the Native Americans' food supply. Story 17. Before he died, Martin Luther King Jr. was hated by liberals for opposing the Vietnam War. This convicted murderer said he didn't kill Martin Luther King. The King family sued the United States government for $1 to prove the government was part of the conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King and won. Story 18. Thousands of soldiers from the South fought for the Union in the Civil War, and there were business leaders in southern cities who didn't want secession. Story 19. Philadelphia's firebombing of the Move compound and predominantly black neighborhood in 1985. Democrat Mayor Wilson Goode and Police Commissioner Gregor J. Sambor declared Move a nonviolent, black liberation movement, a terrorist organization. 11 people were killed, including 5 children, and 250 people unaffiliated with Move were made homeless as a result of the firebomb. They allowed the neighborhood to burn for at least 30 minutes before calling in firefighters. 2 blocks and 61 homes in total burned to the ground. Story 20. The Zoot Suit Riot in Los Angeles. During the times of World War II, white servicemen would target Mexican Americans wearing zoot suits because they considered the outfits to be unpatriotic. Story 21. That Hitler read about California's eugenics program and liked it, but didn't think it went far enough. Thus, the final solution was born. Edit. Eugenics, not euthanasia. Story 22. When I went to school, we were taught that the American Revolution came about because King George III arbitrarily imposed taxes on the American colonists. Many years later, talking to a historian of the 18th century, I learned that the colonists had begged England for aid during the earlier French and Indian War, promising to repay it all, but then once the war was over, reneged on that promise. After repeated and repeatedly rebuffed requests for repayment, and after fair warning, Parliament imposed taxes on the colonies, which were still lower than the taxes British subjects actually living in England were paying, in order to recoup those costs. Bonus fact: I also learned that, contrary to what I was taught in school, it was the colonists who drew first blood in the Revolution, the HMS Gaspé incident, which oddly none of my history teachers had mentioned. Story 23. When the police bombed a successful black majority neighborhood in Philadelphia in 1985, no one was charged for their involvement. It was an unbelievable event. When the government kidnapped people off the street to test drugs on them, it became the backstory behind Stranger Things and Jason Bourne, I believe. Story 24. The United States Civil War was indisputably over slavery. I grew up in Mississippi. They did all sorts of contorting to avoid confronting that, but the biggest bit of dishonesty was that they never even mentioned the existence of the various articles of secession filed by the Confederate States, all of which make it super clear what the reason was. In particular, Mississippi's does not stutter. In the momentous step which our state has taken of dissolving its connection with the government of which we so long formed a part, it is but just that we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution, and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition, or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. Story 25. I was quite surprised that neither my teacher nor my history book mentioned that Sweden started colonization in North America during the 17th century. Story 26. Here in Mexico, the Guerras Indias, the Indian Wars, throughout the history of the Spanish colony to independent Mexico, the government has been hunting and displacing the indigenous people from the north, Sonora, Chihuahua, Coahuila, and the south, Yucatan, the Mayans. There were many massacres, including some of the most obscure battles in both the Guerra de Independencia, Independence War, and the Revolution Mexicana, the Mexican Revolution. Yet, these acts were never printed in the Mexican public history books, and even today, when a great renaissance of indigenous culture is happening, the country still neglects that these wars happened. Story 27. The Reagan administration illegally sold weapons to Iran and used the money to fund right-wing death squads, also known as terrorists, fighting the government in Nicaragua. Story 28. Hitler's racism and way of dealing with it was inspired by America. America got to the moon thanks to Nazi V2 builder Wernher von Braun. Europeans committed genocide on purpose against Native Americans. The complete depopulation of many areas that already had structures and planted farmlands greatly increased the ease at which Europeans were able to settle in. America brought on over 1,600 ex-German scientists, many Nazis in there right after World War II. Basically, the same people creating all the systems of killing went right into the United States payroll. Basically, history is written by the winners, and the winners do not like to look bad when writing history books.